This progressive development model was very, very much based on this notion of growth. Only if you grow, you can live better. And I think we have, particularly based on that very notion of development, created a lot of problems for us as human beings, but human beings on a planet. We are embedded in modernity, and which means we need partnerships. We need partnerships over resources. And I think this is very much where I also support Fadel and his colleagues' notion of bringing value creation to where the value is created. If you talk about just transition, there is a higher responsibility of richer countries to provide, but provide in a fair way. Technology, knowledge transfer, and so on is a necessity. These things need to be negotiated with a new notion of development that is actually compatible with future generations' needs, with social justice on a, let's say, national, but also on an international or interrelational kind of international level between nations, because we have only one planet that we share. So it's really more about power sharing, the question is really on what basis power is shared.
كلوجة بودكاست حلقة جديدة. أهلا وسهلا مرحبا بكم. أنا عرفت بن مرزو. نحن في الحلقة متاع اليوم باش نحكيو على مفهوم التنمية كتصور بدأ بعد الحرب العالمية الثانية، وكان يقدم كتصور باش يخلي الدول تتحسن تقدم وتلبي احتياجاتها واحتياجات العباد اللي تعيش فيها. لكن نتصور المفهوم هذا عاش عديد تحديات من السبعينات، ويظهر لي توا ثم بليزيور توندونس ودي موفمون اللي قاعدين تنظر باش تخلي المفهوم هذا يتطور وينجم يمكن خير يحد أكثر من المساواة اللي موجودة في العالم في الوقت الحالي. باش نحكيو في الموضوع هذا مع هايكي لوشمان اللي هي المديرة متاع مكتب تونس المنظمة هاينريش شبال، وباش نحاولوا نقسموا معها الساعة القادمة في الموضوع هذا وفي التعقيدات متاعه. هايكي مرحبا.
Thank you very much, Arafat, for the invitation.
I think there is a lot of thoughts and ideas and very interesting concept to talk about, basically regarding development and the need to move forward, new concept, new perceptions. And through this journey, I think starting from the early 60s or 70s, the world in general tried to find something that help him and help the people to have a better life. So to start, let's talk a bit about the general of the concept of development and going a bit in the history of the term.
Well, yeah, first of all, thank you for having me, Arafat. It's a very, very important topic because we are urged by climate urgencies to really rethink development and the term itself. I think development was predominantly really conceived as a concept of superlatives, of progression from lower to higher, like a little bit like the Olympics, higher, faster. So I think this is like deeply enshrined in, from going forward, this whole notion of progress and a better future that we really need to develop from, let's say, lower to higher. Mm-hmm. And the question is really, what is low and what is high? And where have we actually come from historically as humanity? And where are we at now? And I think we have, particularly based on that very notion of development, created a lot of problems for us as human beings, but human beings on a planet.
What?
And we cannot isolate ourselves as human beings from other areas of the world, other part of the world, but also not from nature and the Earth's capacity system. And I think this is like where like back in the 70s, there was a very critical debate that started with the so-called Club of Rome, calculating if we go ahead like until the 70s into the future, we will actually overshoot the Earth's capacity. And there was this declaration of limits to growth, because this progressive development model was very, very much based on this notion of growth. Only if you grow, you can live better. You have something to share. You have more to share. Maybe also more like socially just to share with these notions as well. But it's always been this element of you have to produce more to consume more. So the whole notion of consuming is an underlying concept of, let's say, the capitalist system that is based on commodification of almost everything. Nature, natural resources.
Everything, actually, everything.
Yeah, land, property, knowledge. Us as commodified, let's say, workers in the salary market. So yes, I think this is when there was, like, let's say, the first kick to, oh, I think we have a problem. Then we also had the Brundtland report, which actually preceded the Earth Summit. The then Norwegian Prime Minister called, researchers to look at exactly these notions, and the idea of sustainable development, sustainable living came into the global narrative, which then also led in 1992 to the first Rio Earth Summit, really kind of considering as humanity, it was also a UN-led process. Where do we want to go? Where can we go? And how do we actually have to balance development rights of the so-called global south vis-a-vis the already kind of overshooting global north? And I think then we had like the UN-led process of defining in 2000 the Millennium Development Goals, which was, let's say, from a nowadays notion, very, very much a patronizing kind of concept. The global north was made responsible to help the global south to, kind of get out of poverty. 8 goals were defined. I think it was in 2002 that Kofi Annan, the then UN General Secretary, called for kicked off the Millennium Development Campaign. So that was very much also everywhere. Global South, Global North, NGOs were kind of campaigning to really reach these goals.
Yeah, we bring everybody in the same train and
exactly, but pretty much on that broken model. Yeah. So then we went into the notion of sustainable development. And in 2015, the sustainable development goals were defined. It was, if you so want, like a follow-up conference of the UN-led process on the Millennium Development Goals. So the 8 goals to alleviate poverty, have access to water, and so on, education, also like for women, and so on. That was kind of replaced by the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were meant, and I think this is a little bit of progress meant for both the Global South and the Global North. So it was a global agenda to rethink development. I actually personally, I'm not really a fan of all these kind of
concepts. And
I think the concept of sustainable development is not bad, it depends, but different people really kind of determine it in different way, define it in different way. But what I really feel very problematic, that there are always these there are like, for each goal, so and so many indicators and performance factors, and everything is like measuring the world of progress. And I think it's also a mechanism to bring people into this notion, yes, we are moving into the right direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's very interesting, because in some ways, so we create tools to make everybody the same in some ways, with the same goals and with the same needs, and it serves in some ways the sustainable goals, but in other ways we make some common movement for nations and cultures to move in some direction. I don't know. So,
but I think it's the illusion that is given, that if you are kind of as a world community mapping out then from 2015 onwards the Sustainable Development Goals, that we are really making progress. And certainly there are certainly contributions. There's also finance kind of provided for these kind of mechanisms and so on. That cannot be denied, but it is really kind of so minimal to what needs to be done. And I think that really brings us back to this very outset notion of where do we want to go? Where do we can go? Where can we go as humanity based on a limited Earth capacity? And at the same time, we know that there are very different historical, not only accumulation of carbon footprints, but also historical imbalances that actually need to taken into account if this whole, what we call also transition, is to be a just transition. And here we are with the very notion also of transition. Transition, I mean, everybody knows, like if you are in transit, you have left a place, you are in transit, and you see like when the next door opens, like how long does it take to arrive? So it's a description of a process. You want to somehow go from A to B. But then the question is, how? On what kind of underlying criterion, ontological kind of implications do you want? Is it really transformation? Is it transformative? Are there elements of transformation in this transition process? Transformation in the sense of it cannot be the same model to be continued and neither for the North nor for the South. But, and this is like where the MDGs already had this element, which then was later also enshrined in the SDGs and the climate negotiation, this common but differentiated responsibilities. Yeah. Again, also nice word, nice term, nice imagination, but it really kind of needs a whole ecosystem of finance institutions and also an ontological shift of the thinking of development to really get there. Then we also very often discuss this notion, okay, there's reform. We talk a lot about reform. And reform is definitely something which reforms from point A to somewhere, right? And reform is very often a good thing because it at least implies change from institutional, but maybe also from a developmental orientation perspective. But the question is this reform supporting a kind of status quo, or is it really a contribution to this transition or even transformation? Because the transformation notion carries that quality of different underlying criteria of development, not just growth. Because our development model, I said, the output, you need more to share more, maybe also to share more just, but it's very, very growth oriented. And the question is not that we totally kind of want to do away with growth, but the question is, what is to grow? Who needs to grow.
A lot of cost stuff.
And so is it only the criteria, the growth criteria so far? The very predominant growth criteria is the BIP, or the BSP. So it's very much an indicator that I consider a pretty dead indicator, because it does not take into account
environment, health, and all.
and real prosperity for the people. And very often it's an indicator that externalizes costs. Since we were speaking about the Earth summits and so on, one of the key criticisms that actually also turned out of the Brundtland report and other pre-runner documents that led to the Rio summit was environmental costs are not taken into account. They are not like in the investment plan, or the recovery of destruction of environment is not there. So this was addressed with the mechanism of the so-called polluter pays principle.
Okay.
Yeah. So like a term and a mechanism that to different extents actually works. I mean, if you want to park your car these days, you have to pay because you're actually polluting, because you come in with a
some
private
consciousness.
Yes. So I mean, just like as a very, very simple kind of example. But if you look at care, like the work that is needed as a prerequisite to maintain the notion of development, the way we work, that we sell our labor. There was a lot of investment, effective investment of our parents, particularly our mothers, but also schools, like the whole nursing system that made us the human beings that we are, that are qualified to sell their
all the health workers.
Yes,
the list is big.
This is exactly like this is the care part that is in the so-called market, because health workers are paid either in the public or private sector. This is the same also for school teachers, for nurseries and kindergartens and the crèche and so on. But these are and of course the caretakers of the elderlies. These are jobs that are paid, but they are low paid. And there is a lot of work that's performed in households, and we need to say predominantly by women, that's not neither visible nor accounted for, nor does it contribute in any way to the famous BIP. Yeah. So you can consider that also an externalization. And at the end of the day, if you really look at economy, what is economy? Economy is like economos. It's like our household. This is the Greek word that's behind to say like this is like proper householding. That's the very notion of it, which means normally all the accountants, they would come. You have to have a balance check that's
normally
where you are not overshooting. Like you cannot spend more of what you pay and so on. So it has to be kind of balanced. And then you have to ask the question, like a housewife would say, okay, I have such and such budget. Where are the priorities? Yeah, good food, good education, if that's provided by the state. Public services, if they are good, you need less on your paycheck. You see? At the same time, there is a lot of work that women perform, also men. And by the way, the National Statistics Institute of Tunisia performed an inquiry, I think it was in 2008, with the popular census that they sent out household time survey sheets where men and women were asked to kind of note down how many hours or minutes a day they actually perform for these kind of works, like looking after the children, dishwashing, cleaning, and so on and so on.
More.
Right. So, and that gave them an idea of the economic contribution of women and men in that very, very private, invisible sector, but which is absolutely a precondition to maintaining our growth model and system, and also
world.
public services, everything, right? So it's really interesting to see that in the context of environment, we have acknowledged the externalization of environmental costs, whereas like the care part is still pretty much invisible and unrecognized. At the same time, we see, because there's lobbying and there is these kind of surveys that have a certain impact, they lead to mechanisms to address this. And for example, if you stick to care, if you look in Germany or France, you have, probably you also have that in Tunisia, but in Germany or France, it's part of the health insurance system that you have caretakers who run around with their little cars, and they come to this granny and that grandfather, and do the things. And then there is a fixed cost for helping to brush the teeth, redoing the bed.
Okay.
These kind of things. And they are under time pressure, and they are running around, and they are ticking the box because they are paid for these individual services. So it's an extreme monetization of care, whereas care is affectionate work. You need some time even to talk to the people, maybe to listen to some of the grievances. Or when it's about small children, we know that they are not, as rational as you would efficiently want them to behave. And in the context of environment, we have observed I think it was in 2012, this was the Rio +20 summit, 20 years after the 1992 summit, that UNDP brought into the discussion this idea of ecosystem service. So if you want, it's earth care. So they said, okay, indigenous communities will be paid for taking care of maintaining the kind of ecosystem. So they are paid not to destroy. And in Europe, we even had this plan that each community council needed to somehow do an ecosystem assessment. And so the birds, particular species were given a particular prize.
That's pity, but it brings everybody in the same table with the same currency. So I think in some ways we have to change the currency, or change the currency in the mind of the people.
The thing is that these kind of taking into account that there are services that are invisible, this was the critique, both, externalization, of course, to take that into account is a positive move. At least the problem was recognized and addressed. But the modus operandi of addressing this is very, very much enshrined in this growth-oriented, monetized, commodified development model. So a care act needs a price. A bird or another kind of plant species needs a price to see that, because otherwise you don't have like measures to weigh and to assign a price at the outset that need to be maintained to not destroy, or to give a mayor a kind of decision-making base to say, okay, this investment kind of has to take place there because it destroys less environment. Or, and here comes the next notion, the investor has to compensate loss of either biodiversity or, or like nesting grounds for birds or whatever, or the destruction of a whole forest. You have to replant somewhere else. You see, it's a very transactionalist notion in it. And I think there was a whole industry behind after 2012 to get this notion going. I have the feeling there is the realization that it didn't really quite work. So, but you see, there are always these kind of grand narratives that come into the world and that are not really contributing to solutions. It's idea of transition, to do things differently, to address recognized problems, to even with the notion of justice for those indigenous communities, for example, to be paid for the services that they actually provide. But this is totally incompatible with their worldview and with their understanding of self, with their relation to nature, to be paid for something which is inherently their way of life, without idealizing, right?
Yeah.
But it's really more the general notion.
Maybe the problem in this point is the need or the compulsive need to create a very universal way of giving price or pricing, or maybe it's completely different from countries to make, for example, in application some relation between the needs and the care and the money. Every nation, every culture has its own, schema of transactional, if we can say this. But the fact that we are in the way to, we need to fix a very common way to deal with everybody, every country, every culture, every ecosystem, which is, for example, the ecosystem services. The problem is coming from this.
To some extent, from the perspective of those who want to fix it. And here, this was the UN or this very concrete UNDP-led process. So it's the United Nations Development Program that came up with this notion to address issues that were recognized, but to my understanding in an ill-conceived way. And I'm not sure whether this whole notion ever trickled in here in Tunisia, whether you really had a particular policy imprint of that, or whether Tunisia came into all of this at the moment when they have already started to realize it's not quite working. There was, of course, a lot of contestation of this whole notion. Particularly, I was myself. I have attended Joburg. This was Rio +10, but then also I was in Rio for the Rio +20, where this was really very much like the talk in town, right? And Rio, which means Brazil as a host, with the Amazonas and with a diversity of ethnocultural, a kind of indigenous culture, they were out in arms. And there, the whole notion was they wanted to defend their commons against these market-based mechanisms. And of course, there have been some buyovers of some chiefs, communities. And maybe there are even also examples that show some of these mechanisms have been worked in a decent, reasonable, fair way. I don't want to deny that. I'm really contesting the overall notion, because that's, again, here, this was the outset of our discussion. It is maintaining the same underlying ontology of our understanding of development, of progression, of more
vertical,
higher. It's like, it's this kind of market-based instruments that can help fix the problem, whereas they very often are the root cause of the problems. You see?
Yeah. I think in some ways it's very clear when you put yourself from exact position to observe and to see and try to criticize the mechanism of development. But when you are inside the system and you see how much is complicated through all the layers of the international politics and all the needs and the interests and even the financial system. So you just stuck and say how we can, from our level, people, thinkers, artists, who can propose different concepts to try to bring people in this direction. So, I mean, we can propose ideas, but when the system, this actual system, is mainly depending on few very deep symbols, like, for example, greed, like power, so we will not be far away from the same balance of power and balance of this feeling of colonialism. I don't know. It comes to my mind.
Yeah.
So what do you think?
I think, well, I mean, you're addressing a real dilemma. It's easy to talk about development dilemmas when you are sitting in institutions or when you have to run a country or a ministry, or even to see that you have kind of more holistic, like integrated approaches to, let's say, agricultural development, water scarcity, just kind of a share for people, stabilizing food prices, the absolute necessities. You have to deal with a very, very complex system of problem solving challenges. The issue still is policymakers and people in the institutions, including also civil society, the citizen who is actually like really very, at the very root cause, demanding actually policies that help a decent living, they are all embedded in this notion of a commodified, monetized, transactionist worldview. I mean, each and every one of us.
Yeah.
You see,
it's a common imaginary.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think there is a growing let's say ecosystem of alternative thinking, alternative economics thinking, and there's like very different notions of it. I mean, here in Tunisia, you have this movement of the économie sociale et solidaire, social and solidarity economy. There's even, I think, an organic law that is just not yet working because it needs guidelines for implementation. You have, I think, also a more NGO-based ecosystem of alternative, let's say, social entrepreneurship, taking social justice issues, but also environmental issues, let's say less packaging or less waste or fair payment, or like more commonly shared decision-making about reinvestment of benefits or profits, so to say. You have that. We also have, like, because we have the digital economies now, there was a big hope that in the digital sphere, because you have all these platforms available where you can actually match demand and supply. If you look at like Uber or even also Bolt, Airbnb, TaskRabbit, there's lots of platforms that were created based on our personal data. You see? Mm-hmm. The personal data are the new resource, the excavated resource, that do not necessarily destroy environment, but they still belong somehow to us. So these data actually go to a very kind of creative investor who says, okay, here we have an underuse of, let's say, cars, private cars. We also have an underuse of apartments, because there's always, or children are grown out, they have moved out and there's space. So you can actually use that. You don't need to build new hotels. There were all these, let's say, progressive ideas behind to say, We don't need to own. We need to be able to use. In the very moment we need a car, we take an app and check where is the next fellow, right? Or like for taxis, we have alternative options, and through an app, you have a more convenient service. So this, there was a hope that all of this like digital platform provision can lead to a more fair share. And you still have ecosystems which are more labeled, let's say, platform cooperativism, but the majority is really platform capitalism. Again here, with the same notion.
We reproduce the same.
We reproduce the same.
world.
It's the same also culture and art. You have patenting or you have the copyright. Licensing, patenting, or copyrights that determine a particular, let's say, creational process or its output is kind of managed through a property system.
Yeah, in science also.
So we have it in science, we have it with school and textbooks, we have it even also with dance. There is a clear notion also in music, more than 3 steps.
It's mine.
That you copy from somewhere else would be a copyright breach. I mean, this is like totally kind of hindering or blocking or limiting human creation.
Obsessional.
Right? So it shows all these elements are somehow one and the same. And still we are always thinking, okay, this is a reform or this is a transition from here to there, you see? But I think you were like hinting at a particular notion, and that's like where I found working with, let's say, people who have kind of started to redefine certain things, terms, in this ecosystem of commons or commons-based economies, that there is a parallelity of what they actually came up to. And you know, you had here another podcast with Emily and Olfa on the commons, and we also organized a regional summer school with our colleagues from the region. People were there from Ramallah, from Morocco, Rabat, and other places, and also from Lebanon. And we had our partners invited and so on to really debate across countries, among ourselves, about alternative notions of, let's leave out development or economy, of organizing our lives, our basic needs, which is so super important, because in particularly our neighboring countries, it's not true for Morocco, certainly states are either failed, or they are impoverished. Tunisia and Morocco still have, let's say, strong states. And Tunisia comes from this tradition of a provider state, you see? So, but still also we see here that public services are declining, education, health, it's more and more privatized.
That's true.
So there are all these challenges, and that led us also to think it's not just Tunisia, because I have a backpack working on these issues in other contexts where we said we need to really look at these alternatives of thinking about community-based needs. And community-based needs can, of course, also mean you can scale it. But people need to determine whether they build on private land, or whether they, for example, if there is like a provider state that says, okay, like for example, Austria for a long, long time said, okay, we do not privatize land in the cities. This stays in the hand of the community council, or the city council, but people can build on this ground shared kind of housing, but they are not allowed to kind of, for example, rent out to Airbnb. Yeah, because they are kind of subsidized and they are for, let's say, less
Commercial.
they are for lower income people, which means you keep your city mixed. You have areas where you can call it social housing, but this was really it's more the cooperative model where there's individual shareholding. Yeah. So they all had to also pay in the beginning. So they are co-owning, but it was cheaper than if you go totally private because it's community land or it's like state land, if you so want. So there are options, there are alternatives to organize things in different ways. So getting more and more into this kind of very concrete, partly, applied concepts of, let's say, urban commons, urban planning was an example, but also care, how to organize care in an alternative way, particularly where state-based care systems are failing or extremely expensive.
Inaccessible.
Right? Or inaccessible. Lots of options also, of course, to also challenge in the context of biodiversity, whether, a certain species with the now CRISPR-Cas, it's like this new gene scissors where you can actually kind of engineer the DNA of a particular species. And then you say, oh, it's not the original anymore. It's now, let's say, Monsanto's or Bayer's or whoever. So, I mean, to contest all these notions, this is, I think it's a worldwide movement, and it's a movement both in the North and the South.
But in the scale and in the level of people and community. So I have the feeling that there is a very big distances between decisions making and global level and this concept of at least a very small size of, I don't know, this is my question. If we have ideas and concept of how we can live better, but in the scale, how we can think and move the world to make better decision in the global level. And this is one point. And the other point, maybe in the form of question, now the world is in transition in every levels. So we are moving in a multipolar world. So do you think that this movement can help the development in general, can help the countries and all the different stages and layers to reconsider in another way their needs?
I mean, it's the famous question that always comes, the so-called question of scaling. Yeah, so you are right. Very often, these are very community-based, human to human, trust-based relations to a particular area of land to organize their livelihoods. So in contexts of failing social provisioning systems, it's the best thing people can do to see on the ground that they help themselves and that they grow their humanity and that they rediscover ways of life that their ancestors have also lived. And I think this is like what we discovered in Thailand, in Burma, in Cambodia, in Tunisia, and elsewhere. You really have, let's say, alternative options for economic governance, but you can also say, instead of economic governance, organizing livelihood systems in a sustainable and just way. The moment, and you can actually, these are like little islands, and these are islands against the stream. But if lots of islands are actually floating and they start to federate.
This is the hope.
It's an option you can imagine. And if, let's talk about Tunisia, if there are these islands of alternatives that organize themselves, are supported by a partner state, by an enabling state, a state that is not limiting these kind of self-initiatives, but somehow supporting in different ways, for example, by providing land, urban and also rural, for young people to kind of, make their things. What does hinder, let's say, the Tunisian state to go for these kind of things if the global level is really like a power battle? You can also go away from the very local level and look at the UN-led UNFCCC process on climate negotiations. If you put that into a, let's say, commons governance framework, you have the signing states, they have the parties, and they have regularly the conference of the parties, and they have, the latest was 2015 in Paris, they have the Paris Accord, they have agreed to something. And what is actually what they are governing? It's the global climate. This is like not a little lake or a piece of a forest. This is, if you so want, also an atmospheric commons. And we are now even like going into the next step, the outer space, There is a lot of things going on that need also to be governed, where we don't have UN provisions yet. Like who is actually the satellites, all the things that are actually occupying a new space that is beyond the Earth's capacity, but also beyond our existing interstate governmental institutional way of governing. So if you want, you can. Institutions can work on a very local level. They can work on a national level. And if there is an agreement between parties, you can also consider that the so-called global governance as a
regional.
It's a way. But you also addressed something very important. We are at the moment in a time where we can observe, I think for the last 15 years, and now more recently it became really more apparent that global governance, multilateral governance, the UN system is eroding. And you have at the same time like a new kind of evolution of new clubs. So we actually went from, let's say, multilateral, more UN-based framework that never really worked that well.
For some people.
Yeah, it depends. And also the UN system cannot be better than its member states. And of course, you have again here enshrined the global, or the common but differentiated responsibility. So rich countries need to pay more for how ill-conceived it might be, MDGs, SDGs, climate adaptation, mitigation, and so on, loss and damage, and, all these kind of mechanisms, all these animals. There is a huge kind of global governance or multilateral kind of governance zoo out there. At the same time, I think we see now really also like a geostrategic shift of power. So for example, before I got to take over the Tunisia office of the Böll Foundation, I was the head of international politics at the headquarters. And that was the time where...
When?
That was, I came back from Thailand in 2010. It was like 2010 to mid-2017. So this was really the evolution of the BRICS. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we had partners in Brazil who said, like, hey, guys, you have offices in all the BRICS countries. BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So let's team up.
I mean, right now, I think.
Well, this is like a more recent development. I'm talking about, let's say, 2012, 13, 14, where the BRICS kind of evolved, and not only this 5-country group, but also a currency reserve that they built, and a bank. And that was a clear response to, let's say, the resistance of the US to reform the World Bank. Right? So it's because
it's too slow.
Well,
It's too big, yes.
yeah, but I think
Nobody can have the
because they have the US, I mean the dollar as the global currency puts them really into this mighty position, which is, of course, it's the currency reserve and also the BRICS Bank of first these 5 initial countries was a response to say, okay, like if one of our 5 countries has a kind of liquidity problems, we don't need to ask the World Bank. We are not dependent on, let's say, US voting rights and, and kind of, or special drawing rights, these kind of mechanisms that can be applied to help in, let's say, financial crises of particular countries. Then, of course, the BRICS Bank was totally overtaken by the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank, which is China-led, which really kind of financed the Belt and Road Initiative. This is a huge infrastructure connectivity.
In terms of liquidity or in terms of power?
In terms of providing the finance.
Okay.
Providing the finance.
And definitely power.
Yes, and that means power. So, but it's alternatives, you see. They have different operational mechanisms, different kind of conditionalities to loans, or they invest very often also themselves. We have seen that they are kind of very well positioned in Africa, which also starts here and there making trouble. And again here, like if you look at China, or I go to Little Cambodia, this will be my next term. And if you are looking at the housing market, and I have lived there as a student in the 80s and worked there in the early 90s after the UN mission. So this is 30 years ago. Now, what a real estate agent provides you is the option to move into the J Tower, 72 stories high, right? Yeah. And you can have an apartment. You feel like alive as in the hotel. You see, when I was asking them, hey, do you have something down to earth? You see, they still have some, but it's not the predominant thing. So you can see that even like a small and very kind of troubled nation, like Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge and the aftermath and all of that, they totally embraced a development model that's definitely also neither just nor sustainable, but very much also China-led, you see? So we really have to see that even with this power shift and the whole notion of just transition that we also find in the report that Fadel Kaboub and some other colleagues of his have authored for a just transition for Africa. On what development model do they base that? I think they really very much emphasize industrialization and really kind of local value chain creation. All great, absolutely necessary, because otherwise you cannot get out of this imbalance. But at the same time, we see also in Kenya, for example, South Africa, these are the leading nations on the African continent where you have an aspiring youth, you have really kind of this kind of demographic kind of push, because they have huge masses of young people who also look every day out into the world and have aspirations. how do you actually balance, this creative power and that want, and also that right to development? But then the question, what type of development are they aspiring? And very often we find that copycat mechanism, copycat development, which means copier-coller, copy paste. So this is like a certain notion. We want that. We want to have a power shift, definitely, but potentially on a notion of an outdated way of leading as our investments and our development into a healthy pathway that is actually like leaving for children and grandchildren like a planet to live on. And in this context, I found it very, very interesting. There is a guy, a Senegalese philosopher, artist, I think also anthropologist, Felwine Sarr, who wrote Afrotopia. And honestly, it was mind-blowing for me to see when I was reading. There's also, originally it's in French, so there's English, German translation, maybe also other languages. So what I really felt encouraging is the way he proposed decolonization is very closely linked to all these notions that we have worked on with Silke Helfrich and David Bolyai, and this whole ecosystem of commons-based alternatives to really kind of take out this notion of development, which is very much mind-polluting. So Fadel and also Salvini, they call it, we need to decolonize our minds. Yes, but that also means that we have to question whether it is in Germany, and I have grown up in East Germany. So I think until I was this the wall came down, my ecological footprint was probably smaller than one of a Tunisian, you see? So it's not just a notion of North, South first, third world. I mean, if you take these calculations, I'm then probably from the second world, which does not exist anymore, or we have, I don't know, maybe it's Russia, or, these are notions which I think we really need to rethink, and see, because there's also, and I don't want to relativize anything, but there is also definitely the notion of global north in the global south. We have extreme inequalities.
In the mind.
In the mind. And again here, this whole embrace of growth-based development, the Olympic disciplines, faster, higher, wider, this is this enshrined notion of progress, which you can even see in urban development, that you have these high risers, because land is expensive, there is not much left, so you want to optimize, so you build high. Is it really needed? Do you really need this? How many people actually have been kind of deprived of their original livelihoods to have that development space available, and for whom? So I think these are eternal questions, and I really encourage everyone to look into this Afrotopia, which is on the one hand an analysis, it is a vision, and also, of course, an utopia, but at the same time it's also an invitation to rediscover notions of civilizational knowledge, of ways of learning, of ways of living that Africa has. And we have seen it here in our little journey to discover commons-based initiatives and also kind of notions of the past that have been considered outdated, not modern. But Felwine Sarr does not speak about decolonization and decolonization of the mindset in a, let's put it, ideological way, but in a way that he says we are not denying modernity. We are embedded in modernity, and which means we need partnerships. We need partnerships over resources. We need, and I think this is very much where I also support Fadel and his colleagues' notion of bringing value creation to where the value is created.
Okay.
If you look at chocolate, why is it actually Belgian and Swiss chocolate that's so famous? You don't have cocoa plants there. I mean, but they have really mastered and refined the kind of production of chocolates in very different kind of tastes and packaging and became like a brand. Whereas actually the cocoa plant is, in many African countries to be found. It's the same also with tea. And other curry. I mean, this really brings us into this whole notion of where we actually started off, where things got extremely wrong and where there is a lot of injustice that has happened also with colonial past, which has helped accumulate the resources for the global north to evolve and develop. And so I think, yes, there is, if you talk about just transition, there is a higher responsibility of richer countries to provide, but provide in a fair way. Technology, knowledge transfer, and so on is a necessity. But if that leads to the notion, you had your time, now it's us, it will not lead to peace. You see? So I think these things need to be negotiated with a new notion of development that is actually compatible with future generations' needs, with social justice on a, let's say, national, but also on an international or interrelational kind of international level between nations. And I am afraid we are at the moment, at the time where these global institutions who actually could really spearhead that type of just transition are not working well. And as I said, the UN system can only be as strong as its member states make it.
We are guiding by them. I'm interested in a very basic, maybe philosophic way of thinking of the meaning of the power. So it comes from there. So why power? There is no limit to power. So we cannot limit power. And this is, in some ways, there is the mixing also between power and the absolute meaning and capital and money. And when we see in the scale of countries, and we easily can recognize that states want to be powerful, countries want to be powerful. And then they try to do this by trying to collaborate with money, with with finance. So from the roots, it's not well start. So we cannot be questioning the result.
You already touched upon us. Power and wealth, are related. And wealth was historically created in very different and unjust ways, for one. We also have a financial system that's very unequal and that needs to be reformed or really transformed, in the true sense. At the same time, you also have, let's say, geographic and demographic factors. So I just addressed Africa. They, in terms of population growth, they have been lagging behind because the whole slave trade and so on has, for decades, centuries to centuries, actually diminished the population growth that we would have normally seen. We had, in China, for example, we had really kind of an engineered population decline with the one-child policy, which is going to be very problematic for China for the future. Whereas there is, as I said, this aspirational kind of young kind of creative and life hungry kind of use a population group that needs to be provided for. So you have in history always, you have at different moments in time, you have very powerful nations. I mean, China is just huge, has a population, even if it's declining. They have, if they search for talents, they can really search from a larger pool compared to Tunisia. And still, you can see what I consider the real wealth until now of Tunisia is its human resources, even though you are only 11, 12 million, because still education system, particularly also university system, is still kind of creating bright minds. So it's this kind of notion of wealth. It always depends where you look at. So I think there's human resource wealth in Tunisia. Still, in terms of territory, it's small, can be compared with, let's say, Algeria. And at the same time, it has a geographic location, which somehow, historically and also I think in the future, kind of binds it to the other side of the Mediterranean, which is Europe, also in terms of people, where people migrate and where they send their remittances from. There is more now also going far away, like, okay, Canada, you also have the Gulf states, these more recent developments. But at the same time, you have Brazil, you also have South Africa. You cannot really compare power and power. But, and I think this is like a notion that is, which I observed, Tunisia was always very keen to align itself with the multilateral system. It's not anymore. I mean, we had in the 2014 constitution, we had the hierarchy that, international treaties were to be given a higher priority. It's now not the case anymore. But I think that notion also came from we as a small nation are more dependent on a multilateral system in which we can find protection,
it's more safe,
where we can align. I also remember we had, like in the agricultural context, the WTO at the time in 2005. That was my time in Thailand, where we had the group of the G33, which were really kind of teaming up to challenge the notion of agricultural trade and said, like, food and agriculture needs to go out of the WTO because we have this notion of culture in the agri. It's a whole culture. It's not just commodities. But from a trade perspective, international trade perspective, it was like all just
transactions.
So transaction is so smaller, or like-minded groups need to kind of team up to bring their interests into these kind of multilateral negotiations. But again, I mentioned it's also the WTO system after 2005. That was in Hong Kong. That was pretty much it. WTO has shrunken in power. It was not just, but after we had the evolution of lots of bilaterals, or intra-regional kind of trade treaties, which are not necessarily a better deal. It really depends. And I think it is another kind of example which shows that the multilateral kind of notion of organizing trade, wealth, the exchange of economic kind of capacities of different nations in a just way. So again here, the more powerful determine the rules. And there are some countries, for example, not only China, but also like middle-income countries, like, for example, Thailand or also Malaysia, they would be able to send a fleet of lawyers to contest certain things. Whereas a country like Tunisia or Cambodia is less likely to really get its particular national interest accommodated, right? So it needs more the kind of teaming up, the grouping of like-minded countries. But again here, we have talked about the erosion of this multilateral system. So I think we really need to reinvent mechanisms of negotiations and balancing the opportunities for, let's say, relative latecomers or smaller nations to really claim their development rights and their development space, but not necessarily on the broken notion that we discussed earlier, that to do more of the same just for other people. Because I think this is not going to really lead us to, because we have only one planet that we share. So it's really more about power sharing the question is really on what basis power is shared. And I think this is the underlying question, which again also has the power question in it, because who determines, who actually calls the shots? On what base, with what notion, in what directions are we going? Both with reforming the financial system, but also like the trade system or the UN climate context. It's very much determined by powerful nations, and not only that. The whole private sector, like lobby groups, which are trying to really kind of keep the status quo for their interests. And decarbonization is not falling from the sky. It is. I think people have understood that it's needed, but the question is how and who actually provides technology, finance, and the way forward. Yeah. So again, here we always are stuck with the need of negotiating pathways to kind of get to where maybe at least a majority of people on the earth want to go.
Yeah. Maybe final question. If you project, for the near future, do you think that at the global level, the global leaders can move in a right direction by themselves, or we have to wait to a dead point?
Very, very difficult question. I don't think that global leaders will easily find a consensus because, again, here, it's all a question of power, maintaining either a status quo or keeping like certain, areas of influence intact. There is now, we see it globally, there is very much this notion of my country first, right? Which means it is less likely that leaders find an agreement that is really more equal and balanced when it comes to leaders from big and leaders to small countries. Of course, we see these kind of alignments. We also see, for example, at the moment, this kind of shift that Tunisia, at least if you look at foreign policy acclamations, like aligning itself more with BRICS and powerful China, Russia, these kind of, as long as it is part of a diversification, okay, fine. But I think it would also be illusionist that the leaders of China or Russia are going to be the just provider for the development needs, let's say, of Tunisians. So I think what we see at the moment is like, Tunisia is at a big fence and is looking both sides, like who is offering what. There is a West alignment, which I also mentioned is historical, but is also geological, because you can, if, for example, if the automotive industry or other sectors would turn more into, let's say, value chains, knowledge transfer created here, still the Tunisian market is not big enough. So it needs countries, consumers, so to say, trading partners in proximity. It can, of course, also go further away, but economically speaking, I think there are realities that cannot be denied.
So, as we are living fully in the transition area, so I cannot keep myself thinking about the post-development area. So, where do you think we are moving on?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Because we need to imagine what is the next model, and I think there is a lot of experimentation, and I think that prefix post to something always gives us the option to say, okay, this is like what I or a group of people imagines to come next. Post development, I don't know. I don't want to decompose kind of the notion of development, but the very notion that we have of development, that needs to be redefined, reconsidered. So post-development is probably not very helpful because it does not really give you a visionary imagination. There's this notion of post-capitalism that might capture some elements of, let's say, the inherent criticism that we have elaborated on earlier, which is like to be transactionist, that we are not considered as relational human beings, that we are not relational towards one each other, but also towards nature and actually the Earth system as such, in which we are embedded. Different notions, also spiritual notions, for example, like self-sufficiency or less or just enough to be happy. These kind of notions could potentially determine something which we could call post-capitalism, because everybody can imagine what capitalism means because we live it every day. So, but still, of course, it needs then to be clearly determined, and different people have different notions of it. I guess that we also have this potential notion of post-extractivism as compared or as opposed to neo-extractivism, right? So we can play with the word, but I think we have to be very clear and determining. I think it's good for classrooms to have these type of debates because it helps people to kind of polish their mindset, or kind of really rethink certain notions. And this is why I said earlier, what we experienced when we were working around imagining a commons-based economy, that we were faced with the need and the challenge to really reinvent vocabulary, because it carries this inherent connotation we are all kind of brainwashed to. So again, here, this is an element of decolonizing mindsets from a development notion that came along with, let's say, colonial powers and history of extractivism and exploitation. So that's probably a way of opening debates and space for reimagination.
Affaire à suivre. Merci, Heike.
Affaire à suivre. Yeah, thank you.